Welcome to Genetics Decoded. I'm Sharon Palmer, your host. Please note that the information presented in this podcast is for general information and is not to be considered medical advice. Today we're going to look at genetics, what your genetic data reports on, and how you can use that information when making decisions around your diet, your supplements, and your lifestyle choices. Today we're going to be getting a little bit more insight into our genetics and what is our genetic data really telling us. We get told that 99.9% of our genetic data is the same across all of us. But then, on the other hand, we're also told that we're unique and that we're individuals. So how does this 0.1% lead into all these changes? And both of these things are true. But that 0.1% makes a huge difference. We're going to look at, how genetics can give us insight in how we differ from person to person. When people do a genetic test, because it's not commonplace right now, so people don't have much of a reference to go by, people are used to getting these tests like pathology tests or even functional tests where they might get a couple of pages or 10 or 15 pages, and they expect that their DNA test is going to fall into this category. But looking at, what is a DNA test really reporting on and how can you use it from a health point of view? What is really clear is that if we get better insight into our health, it allows us to make better decisions, and then better decisions should lead to better health outcomes. So this is really the power, is getting better information upon which we make these decisions around our health. So if we have a look at being 99% the same, what is it that actually changes from person to person? So if we look, your genetic data is an enormous amount of data, but that 0.1% difference equates into about 6 million pieces of genetic data that varies from person to person. That's a lot of information. So 6 million bits of your genetic information are different to somebody else's, and that's where all of the difference lays. That's going to change the way we look, it's going to change the way that our body works, and it's going to change the way we react to our environment. But this is the power, is that if we understand how that is changing, we can also understand where we need to intervene and how we should intervene. So the first thing is, 6 million pieces of genetic data is an enormous amount of data. Like, how do we find that genetic information? And so what I want to do is get a little bit technical here, but not too technical at all. So most of us are really aware of that DNA structure. So we see it, it looks like a little bit of like a ladder, but then it's got this lovely little twist to it. Very elegant when you look at it. When we look at that DNA helix, you've got the kind of the outside, and then on the inside you've got all of those little rungs of the ladder. Those little rungs of the ladder are called your base pairs. You have 3 billion of them in your body. And of that 3 billion, 6 million of them are different from person to person. So that's what we're really looking at in a genetic test, is going in and looking at how these little base pairs change from person to person. So when we look at base pairs, we refer to the changes that can happen between person to person. We call them SNPs, not SNIP, but SNP. They're called SNPs. It's short for single nucleotide polymorphism, and that's just a really fancy way of saying a variant, or commonly the word mutation is used. So what we're looking for are these SNPs, and if there's 6 million of them that we're trying to find that vary from person to person, we need to find them and we need to accurately identify them. So every tiny little change that can happen in those base pairs is given what's called an RS number. So every single genetic variant is identified with this RS number. This is what researchers will quote when they're talking about research, and this is what your genetic data will pull out. So your genetic data is huge. You wouldn't want to print it out. It would be over 10,000 pages, even more, depending on how much of your genetic data you look at. So this is something when people say to me in clinic, "Oh, I want to have a look at my raw genetic data," and it's like, it's just an enormous amount of information. It's just letters and numbers. It's not like you can pick it up and read it and go, "Oh, okay, that's where my lactose intolerance is, and that's where my gluten intolerance is, and this is where how my enzyme is working in that pathway." You've got to first find the RS number, and then you need to understand what that RS number is signifying. How is that gene changing? If we look at these SNPs, so these single nucleotide polymorphisms, if you change a base pair, you're going to change how a gene works. And pretty much genes are what controls what happens in the body. If you need to make an immune cell, the gene that produces that will turn on and produce your immune cell. If you need to make an enzyme that drives a pathway, the gene that produces that enzyme will turn on and produce the enzyme. What these SNPs do is change the way the gene functions. So let's say you've got a mutation in the gene that produces enzyme A. That change could mean that the enzyme is working less effectively. It could mean that the enzyme is actually working faster and better. Not all changes are risk factors. Some of these changes can be highly beneficial to our health as well. And so what we know is that these genetic variances, they change the way the body works. And if we understand how the body works and where the risk is, this is where we get to intervene and do something about outcomes. What I want to look at is, it's easy to talk about this in abstract ways, but let's kind of take some real examples to see how we can take this genetic data, how we can take these RS numbers and turn them into our understanding, and also how do we make these changes at a clinical perspective from a lifestyle point of view. So let's go back to lactose intolerance. It is the number one genetic variant in the world. It varies between ethnic groups. So about 90% of Asians will be lactose intolerant. Caucasians are quite rarely lactose intolerant. And so again, this is why, you want to go in and look. But when I have people coming in who are Caucasian, and they're saying, "Oh, I'm absolutely lactose intolerant," I go, could be, but it's unlikely. There may be other risk factors that are playing a role here. So lactose is the sugar molecule in your dairy, and in order to break that down, you need to produce the enzyme called lactase. So lactase will break it down and you will turn it into glucose and galactose. But there are some people who don't produce the enzyme called lactase. Now, if you don't produce the enzyme, you cannot break down the lactose. It ends up going into the large intestines where it doesn't belong, and this is where you can end up with a lot of gut pain, a lot of cramping, a lot of diarrhea. So your genetics can very clearly tell us, do you produce that enzyme or do you not? And if you can't, you're lactose intolerant. We don't need to do a food challenge. We don't need to do a hydrogen breath test. We just go in and look at your genetics. It is super, super easy. And then if you are lactose intolerant, if you cannot make that enzyme, then you need to either remove it from your diet or you have to introduce that enzyme into your diet. A lot of people get confused. They think when they buy lactose-free that lactose has been removed. Usually the lactose is still there. What the manufacturer has done is added some of these enzymes back into the product. Okay, but we can very, very easily tell you whether you do or do not make that enzyme. Then we're going to look at another gene called the MTHFR gene. if people are starting to get into the realm of genetics and clinical genetics, we often find this quite strong focus on the MTHFR gene. And it always surprises me because, as I said, there's about 6 million of these that are going to kind of vary from person to person, is that we need to be really careful in that we don't pick just one little gene and one variant and think that that's the most important thing across our health. But the MTHFR gene has a lot of focus now. We get a lot of people calling saying, I want to do my MTHFR gene because I've heard a podcast and they've mentioned it. If we have a look at what this gene really is looking at, it all comes back to what we call our folate metabolism. So folate is one of your B vitamins, it's your B9. Your folate will be delivered from the food that you eat. So if you eat spinach, you would be introducing quite a lot of folate into the body. But the body isn't using folate. The body has to metabolize that folate into the activated form called 5-methyl tetrahydrofolate. And you've got a number of enzymes that are involved in that folate metabolism pathway. Your MTHFR genes are the final step in that folate metabolism. So one step finally takes you to this 5-methyl tetrahydrofolate form. Now, in people who have these MTHFR genetic variants, the enzyme that's doing that conversion is just working ineffectively. So people are not good at producing good levels of this 5-methyl tetrahydrofolate. If we know that, like if you're not good at producing it, we want to introduce it from a supplement form. There are very few foods that will have good levels of this 5-methyl tetrahydrofolate, so you really need to address this mutation from a supplement point of view. But what I often see is people identify the MTHFR variant, but then they totally miss getting the intervention right. And that's the thing that you really need to understand. Getting that genetic data is the first step. It is really important that you get the intervention right. Otherwise, you've not solved the problem and you want to get in, because this 5-methyl tetrahydrofolate is the form of folate that will be pulled into this really important methylation pathway. And that methylation pathway allows you to produce your methyl groups. And when we look at how we control our genes, we're turning our genes on and off all day. Everything starts at the level of genetic expression. When we want a gene to be silent and wait until we need it, what we do is we methylate it. So we put this methyl group on it and we basically kind of silence it and hold it in place. When we want that gene to do its job, we remove the methyl group, the DNA will unravel, it will produce whatever enzyme or protein it needs, and then it will pack itself up and you'll remethylate it. So we're methylating millions of times per day. So it becomes really critical to produce enough of these methyl groups. And so if you can't produce enough of this activated folate, this 5-methyl tetrahydrofolate, you won't have enough to pull into this methylation pathway, and it will impact on your production of methylation. And so we know that that's a really important pathway. And this is part of the reason why there's this real focus on the MTHFR enzyme, the gene that produces that enzyme. But you've got all these other steps prior to the MTHFR gene. And so you need to know what's happening there. So it's really important when we're using our genetics is to understand the specifics, but to keep having this big picture focus where we come back out and look at what is the overall pathway and function. And so if someone has this mutation, from a supplemental point of view, you need to make sure that they're taking 5-methyl tetrahydrofolate. That is not a form that is in most over-the-counter supplements. Most supplements will be giving you a folic acid, which is a synthetic form, and that's not going to help you. So this is where if you use your genetics and you're very specific with your choices of supplementation, you can make a really big difference. But if you get it wrong, it's not going to make any difference at all. And so a lot of people are taking supplements that are just not the right form, maybe not even delivered in the right way. So you can go in and you can look at the specifics around these certain genes and the enzymes that they produce. Then we're going to have a look at another gene called BDNF. It's called brain-derived neurotropic factor. This gene produces this nerve growth protein. You have really high levels of this nerve growth protein in your brain. It is critical for cognitive health. It is critical for our mental health and well-being. A lot of people have heard of Alzheimer's. We know that, as we're an aging population, Alzheimer's is becoming a lot more prevalent. This BDNF mutation is an independent risk factor for developing Alzheimer's and dementia. But it's also playing a really big role in mental health and well-being. What we need to know, and this is where understanding the gene, if you have a mutation, if you have a variant in your brain-derived neurotropic factor gene, it means that you're not going to be making really good levels of this really critical protein. If we see someone clinically who's got issues around mental health, it becomes very important to go in and look to see, can they produce enough of this brain-derived neurotropic factor? But if someone's got a family history of Alzheimer's and dementia, we also want to go in and look at the capacity to make this brain-derived neurotropic factor. We know that it can impact around our health, but if I say to you, you've got a genetic variant that's making it difficult for you to produce enough of this critical protein, the first thing you're going to say to me is, well, how do I fix that? How do I make it better? And that's the most important thing, is understanding the risk, but going in and improving that. Because if I can go in and help you make more of this brain-derived neurotropic factor, it's going to be impacting around your mental health, around your long-term cognitive health. All of those things are really important. And the thing is, there are a whole range of things you can do to upregulate your production of brain-derived neurotropic factor. It will be based around things like exercise. There will be some key herbs that can do it. There'll be some really important nutritionals that will help to support production. And so you can go in and go, I don't make enough because of this variant, and I'm going to make these key choices and improve my production, and therefore you improve your mental health and long-term can impact on your cognitive health. Those are really, really important things. But, when you look at your health, there are so many things that can show up from a health point of view. People come in with a whole range of different symptoms, whole range of different risk factors in their family medical history. And I always say to people, I don't care how keen you are on your health, at the end of the day, there are only so many things that you can do, so many changes to your diet, so many supplements that you can take, so many lifestyle habits that you can change. What you want to do is know the ones that are really important for you. If I say to you, you can't make enough of that brain-derived neurotropic factor and exercise is going to help here, then it's one of those things like day in and day out, week in and week out, you've got to build that into your routine. I speak to people and I go, when did you last exercise? 35 years ago. And you go, okay, we've got some work to do here. But, some people will say, I'm already exercising. And you go, great, you need to maintain that. It's like once you get that information and you can see what the important interventions are, you can then look to see whether the choices you're making are reflective of what you need to do. And this is where you get to make those changes. And also knowing that those genetic variances are operating over the course of your lifetime. So it's not about being all gung-ho and doing something something for a week and then listening to another podcast or reading something and going, oh, I'm going to try that, is that your genetics allows you to know some of the habits that you've got to really stick with. Consistency over time is where you'll get the biggest impact. And let's have a look at how our genetic variances can impact around exercise. We have a gene called ACTN3, and it produces a protein called alpha-actinin 3. This is a protein that's made directly within your muscle fibre itself. And whether that protein is there in the muscle fibre is going to really determine how the muscle works. How does that muscle contract? How quickly can it contract? How strong and fast can you be? Because what we know is that some people make really good levels of this alpha-actinin 3. Those are the people who are strong, quick and powerful. Other people make this protein, but they make it at reduced levels, and that's going to change, from an exercise point of view, what they may be good at, what they should be doing. But then there's a core group of people that don't make that protein at all. It just simply doesn't exist in their muscle, and that's going to, again, profoundly change what they should and shouldn't be doing in the gym. The people who don't make that protein are really prone to sarcopenia, which is the loss of muscle as we begin to age. And if we look at some of the benefits of exercise, one of the most important is to be able to hold on to our muscle mass, to have a good muscle to fat ratio. But depending on whether you have this protein or not is going to really change your response to things like weight and resistance work. Are you going to respond really well, or are you at risk of not making it enough? And, it's really interesting clinically when I deliver that information. If I have to tell men that they do not have any of this protein in their muscles, I can see they're almost like, well, I'm just going to ignore that because I'm just going to go back into the gym and I'm going to keep trying to lift those weights. But, what we're finding is that if you do not produce this protein, when you go into the gym and try and do resistance work, you're not going to get the kind of gains, the growth in muscle that you would maybe expect based on what you're doing. We know that if you don't have that protein in your muscle, we don't want you to be lifting really heavy weights. We want you to be doing higher reps and lower weights. But if we look at the whole fitness and exercise industry, I think we still see a lot of this, no pain, no gain, just work hard. It's just a function of getting in the gym and doing more. And it really isn't as simple as that. And the research is showing us that if you're choosing to do exercise outside of your exercise phenotype, not only do you not get the results that you're looking for, you may end up with results that you don't want. And one of the risks here is around, muscle injury as you're training, is that people who don't make that protein gives the muscle a lot of stability upon contraction. If you don't make that, then when the muscle is contracting, it's particularly vulnerable to damage. And if you jump in the gym and you think, well, I'm just going to lift really heavy because that's the way I'm going to build muscle, you won't build muscle and you're much more likely to injure yourself through the process. And then the worst outcome is to not be able to exercise at all, especially if you have a brain-derived neurotropic factor variant in which exercise is really important. Trying to make decisions that are going to serve you well short-term and long-term from a health point of view. I also want to look at a really key enzyme that's in our vitamin D pathway. We hear a lot about vitamin D. We hear a lot about its impact from an immune point of view, but what a lot of people do not understand is there are 6 critical steps in that vitamin D pathway. Step number 3 is about the ability to activate your vitamin D. When people say go out into the sun and make some vitamin D, your genetics is determining whether you can or can't. And, we'll be looking at this pathway in a lot more detail in some future podcasts. But whether you're making vitamin D from the sun, whether you're taking a vitamin D supplement or eating foods that contain vitamin D, it is all inactive. And at that point, it has no action through the body. You have a set of enzymes. They're called your CYP27B1 enzymes. These are the only enzymes in your body that can activate your vitamin D. And some people have these genetic variances in this pathway in which they are very, very poor at activating their vitamin D. And you've got to address this, because unless you can get your vitamin D activated, clinically, you're not going to be getting the outcomes. It won't matter that your blood levels are looking better. Your blood levels are checking and measuring an inactive form. And so if we know that you've got risks around this enzyme, there are key things that you can do to upregulate the activity of these enzymes. And knowing that these activating enzymes are at really high levels in your immune cells. They're at very high levels in your bone cells. So again, if you can't activate your vitamin D, there's issues around bone health. There's issues around how your immune system is working. But again, most people would not even realise that, I've got to activate it. How do I do that? So we can use your genetics to show you whether there's a risk in this pathway, and if there is, how you can manage that. But if you can get that enzyme system working, and you can get more activated vitamin D, it's going to impact your health in a whole range of factors. I hope that this has given you some insight into how knowing your genetic data can impact around your health, how it can impact around knowing what's happening or what's not happening, and then that leads you to be able to make the right intervention. So if it's a genetic variant that's impacting on your food intolerances and allergies, you can identify that and then you can make the right decisions. If it's a genetic variant that's impacting around the way your muscle works and the way it produces energy, you can understand how that's changing, and you can also then modify how you're exercising to work more within your exercise phenotype. If it's a genetic variant that's impacting on a really critical enzyme, you can go in and you can do something about it. So this is where knowledge gives you key insight and where you can make much, much better decisions around what you're choosing to do. Thank you so much for listening to Genetics Decoded. If you enjoyed the episode, please remember to subscribe, like, and share. Tell your friends all about what we're doing, because we truly are individuals. Your genetic data can be used for you to make much better decisions around your diet, supplements, and lifestyle. Join me each week to find out how.